born in Rochester, Michigan in 1956. Because of the level of notoriety her crimes achieved, she was inaccurately named America's first female serial killer. Wuornos was born to a child molester and an unreliable teen mother. Wuornos' father was out of the picture before she was born, eventually killing himself in his prison cell when she was 13, and she was abandoned by her mother as a toddler. Her mother left Aileen and her brother Keith to be raised by their paternal grandparents. Wuornos' grandfather allegedly beat and raped her for years, and at the age of 14, Wuornos became pregnant and was sent to a home for unwed mothers. She claimed that the baby was a result of an incestuous relationship with her brother. After having the baby and returning to her grandparents' house, Wuornos' grandmother died of liver cancer brought on by alcoholism, and she and her brother were kicked out of the house by their grandfather. Wuornos briefly became a ward of the state before running away and beginning to sustain herself with prostitution and other forms of crime. Wuornos was first arrested at the age of 18 for disorderly conduct, driving under the influence, and firing a weapon from a vehicle. After her arrest, she continued on using aliases and committing crime for 2 years before meeting Lewis Fell. When she was 20 years old, after having hitchhiked to Florida from Michigan, she married the 69-year-old yacht club president. After she began fighting in bars, however, Fell became horrified and filed a restraining order. This forced Wuornos to return to Michigan and annul the marriage. This figure provides a visual representation of the events leading to robbery. Wuornos' fraught childhood and her eventual running away made her a participant in street culture, committing minor crimes and surviving by selling her body. This foundation, combined with the financial desperation that arises out of the need for alcohol and drugs, facilitated Wuornos' cycle of armed robberies. Wuornos was arrested numerous times for robbery throughout her adult life. After living in Michigan for a short time following her annulment, Wuornos returned to Florida once again, where she briefly served time for another armed robbery. Wuornos had succumbed to prostitution as a means to an end and was arrested again in 1986 for pulling a gun on a customer and demanding he give her money. Wuornos had fallen into prostitution early in her life, first trading sexual favors for cigarettes before she was even a teenager. Before beginning to perform armed robberies, Wuornos sustained herself through prostitution and simple petty theft. A few years after her arrest for an armed robbery against a customer, Wuornos used prostitution as a means to lure her murder victims to remote locations. Wuornos killed her first victim in November of 1989 and her last in November of 1990. Over the course of the year 1990, 6 bodies were found along the highways of northern and central Florida. Police also found a car connected to a man named Peter Seams, but his body was never recovered. All bodies had been found containing multiple gunshot wounds. In order to lure her victims, Wuornos would pose as a hitchhiker and highway prostitute on the side of the road. After isolating them in remote locations, Wuornos would then turn on them with a .22 caliber pistol. The body of Walter Gino Antonio was found in November, and Wuornos was arrested less than 2 months later on January 9, 1991. Richard Mallory was the only murder for which she stood trial. A jury found her guilty with a recommended sentence of death in January 1992, 1 year after her final arrest. The judge followed the jury's recommendation, and Wuornos received 5 additional death penalties for the remaining murders over the course of 1992. The body of Peter Seams was never found, but Wuornos did confess to the murder. Explaining serial murders is extremely difficult, not because of a lack of explanations, but because of an abundance of them. One of the major problems with explaining serial murders is explanation after the fact. This occurs once the offender has already been identified, as hindsight allows a description of some negative flaw or trait that is supposed to have caused the killing. This is called post-dicting, and according to the text, can be likened to Monday morning quarterbacking. What's more, serial murders are rare, limiting the theories we can use to attempt to explain them. They tend to provide few insights and no predictions when used in the context of serial homicides, as serial murderers are exceedingly diverse. There are 2 obvious theories that can be applied to explain Aileen Wuornos' violence, the first of which being strain theory. The presentation of negative stimuli can facilitate aggression and delinquency. Wuornos' childhood was fraught with abuse, abandonment, and physical and sexual abuse. This took a heavy psychological toll, and it also often led her without the basic tools necessary for survival, such as secure housing. The second theory that may be able to explain Wuornos' crimes is social bonding theory. Wuornos had no parents and an extremely troubled relationship with her grandparents, even alleging that she was repeatedly raped by her grandfather. She had an incestuous relationship with her brother and utilized school as a platform for prostitution. Starting from a very young age, Wuornos never had any appropriate or strong social bonds with any person or institution in her life. Wuornos had a long history of sexual deviancy and abuse, likely being a victim of rape numerous times. A victim of assault may identify with the role of aggressor to overcome a sense of powerlessness and helplessness. In the context of robbery, male-on-male confrontations usually reflect a power struggle. While the reasons men and women commit robberies are generally the same, the methods are different. One of the main methods females utilize to commit robberies is to appear sexually available to a potential victim. This is a practical choice in a gender-stratified environment, such as is found in street culture. Repeated abuse will lead to a sense of lacking control in one's life, and the murder of Richard Mallory was likely one of the first times in her life that Wuornos felt that she had control over a man instead of a man having control over her. These are two quotes that I think encapsulate these theories and explanations well. The first is from Wuornos herself, in which she says, "I robbed them, and I killed them as cold as ice, and I would do it again, and I know I would kill another person because I've hated humans for a long time." The second is from John Tanner, the district attorney on her case in 1992. He said about Wuornos that she liked to be in control. In fact, these killings, as much as anything, were acts of ultimate control, and we've seen that in serial killer patterns in the past. She killed these men to bring about the ultimate in control over their lives, which was to terminate it. Ultimately, Wuornos' life ended in an execution 10 years after living on death row. As early as 1991, before she even first went on trial, Wuornos began to believe that her food was being spat in or otherwise contaminated, going so far as to go on hunger strikes. Prior to the trial, she had also received a diagnosis of psychopathy and borderline personality disorder. In 2001, Wuornos asked her sentence be hurried along, and her request was granted, and she was executed a year later. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Although her diagnosis was admitted as evidence for her defense, the jury decided that despite her psychological difficulties, Wuornos knew the difference between right and wrong. Her borderline personality disorder diagnosis was the sole mitigating factor in her capital murder trial. While I think these few examples indicate intermittent lucidity at best, I'm also reminded of the Penry versus Linaw case of 1989. A person with the mental age of a 6-year-old was sentenced to death because they were declared legally sane, and despite the obvious, Wuornos was put to death for the same reason. I think that the case of Aileen Wuornos is an exemplary reason why we, as a country, need to stop killing people as a way to say that killing people is wrong.